Hey Tyler, how are you?
Hey, doing great. How are you?
Good, good. Just still shocked by all this information about the LastPass breaches that happened last year.
Yeah, interesting. Everything else that's come out since the breaches were originally disclosed in, what was it, October, November of last year that the news came out the first time.
Well, before we talk about this, I just really want to say that, you know, we have to destigmatize companies that experience cyber attacks. It's not LastPass's fault that they're a victim of criminals. There's good people that work there and obviously don't want this to happen. And I want to applaud them for being transparent about what actually was the root cause of the issues and sharing all that. So I think it's really important that we don't kind of stigmatize the victims of these kinds of crimes.
No, I completely agree. And ultimately, I think what we've seen over the last 5-10 years, right, is you can do everything right. And ultimately, there are still cyber attacks that are going to affect every company. It's why this is now a risk management problem. So completely agree.
Tell us what happened.
Yeah, maybe best place to start for anyone who hasn't been following this saga. So last August, LastPass notified its users that they had a security incident in which a third party had compromised a developer's account. They then actually released news about a second security incident in November, but at the time it wasn't clear whether or not the two were connected. They had involved different methodologies, different time. The news that came out recently is that not only were the two connected, but what had actually happened is the bad actor had used some of the data from the first breach in August to actually gain access later to one of the senior developers' personal computers, where they installed a keylogger and they were on system watching, collecting data for several months. What ultimately happened was in keylogging data from this individual's home computer, this was one of 4 engineers who actually had access to certain development API keys. They were able to obtain that information and use that to compromise LastPass more broadly. So in this case, what's interesting to me at least is that the ultimate compromise that the bad actor used to get back into the system was purely on a personal computer. They'd installed full keylogging software on that personally owned computer, and what they were able to do from that was mine access that the user had used through the AWS account to get those API keys, and then from LastPass's infrastructure's perspective, they logged in a completely legitimate way.
Yeah, so it's kind of crazy to think about this. I mean, we think about and talk about employee targeted digital risk all the time, but this is an employee that downloaded, I think it's Plex media server on their home computer, which, they have every right to do. I mean, it's a, piece of software that millions of people use, and it happens, third-party software outside of the company's perimeter is on devices.
And I want to make one point on that, right? I mean, theoretically, it sounds like it's suspected to be Plex, but one thing we don't even know is, was this a legitimate version of Plex, or was this a version infected, a legitimate version with a vulnerability or malware? I remember, maybe a couple of years ago, right, there was a version of a popular BitTorrent going around that was actually infected with malware. So, it's a case where individuals don't even always know the software that they have. And if you're not running EDR on your personal computer, you have no way of knowing whether you've downloaded Plex or this malware version thereof, right?
Yeah, totally. And you can't even run it on yourself either, because it's you can't watch your own back in these kind of situations. But it's interesting because, it was 1 out of 4 people, I think, that had access to the Amazon S3 buckets where customer data was held. They went right for that person and got exactly the crown jewels of the company per se. And this was not an unsophisticated user. This was not
no.
somebody's poor grandmother who doesn't know how to use her iPhone. This was,
and it wasn't an unsophisticated company, right? Four people having access to cloud storage is very reasonable. It's not like it was dozens and dozens of people. So no one made any mistakes on the corporate infrastructure side is the important thing here.
So thinking about this, this is now something that you and I have been talking about for, it's now years. But it's more and more becoming in the forefront of media. We always talk about the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident, which was an attack on an individual. We talk about the incidents at Cisco, Uber, and a bunch of Microsoft that involved individual personal devices and personal lives. I mean, these threats, employee targeted digital risk, is now the primary threat surface for these large-scale attacks. Like, these large-scale attacks are now not entirely focused on the company's enterprise perimeter, the systems, but focused on individuals as a conduit to those systems. And this is what, leading companies have to think about to actually protect company data.
Well, and ultimately the thing that needs to be emphasized, right? These are attacks on company data, even though they're going through the individual. This individual had a keylogger on his personal computer for over a month. A lot of individual data was exposed there, but the motivation was absolutely to go after LastPass, right? So that's the first thing is, individuals are being exposed personally because of the data they have access to at their companies. If this were me and I have everything on my computer keylogged for over a month, leaving totally aside the work piece, I'm pretty upset about it, and I'm a target specifically because of my job. So that's one thing that we need to remember, and everybody needs to remember, right? You're a target because of the data you have access to at work. And then the second thing you said that it's really important is the way that these bad actors then interact with work is really just as the person. So in this case, LastPass's security worked, and they had MFA, they had all the necessary precautions. The issue is that the hacker just logged in as this developer. And that's really the heart of employee-targeted digital risk, whether it's compromising a computer with a keylogger, getting information from a data breach or a data broker site. At the end of the day, the goal is that someone can interact with a company system pretending to be me, pretending to be the senior DevOps engineer.
Yeah, and I think this brings up, for me, the biggest takeaway. Like, if there's one thing that security professionals, engineers, CTOs, CIOs take away from this incident, one thing, that is that employee-targeted digital risk and threats like this one are their own threat surface. It is not just an attack that ends up at the front door of your perimeter and your standard defenses are going to handle. This attack bypassed all of those things and actually operated everything the way it should have been. Like, MFA got triggered, and this did not stop it.
Correct. Well, and I'd add one more thing here. There's a quote in one of the articles that I was reading about this that said that one of the reasons it took them so long to discover this is, to your point, because everything was working as normal. The security logging was working on this individual's access. They were keeping an eye on it. The problem is everything looked correct because it had come in via this other threat surface. So to your point, it's not something where we can assume that at the end of the day, even if there's a breach in a personal system, you'll still catch the bad actor when they try to log into that company system. Once you've successfully impersonated that individual, these attacks are very, very difficult to detect and to stop in a way that's different from if someone's trying to brute force a login directly on a company system. And one of the reasons for that is that the initial access attempts are happening on systems that, for the most part, don't have EDR, they don't have logging. If you can make personal attempts on most people, you can make whatever security attempts you want on their personal computers. You have as many tries as you want. None of it's being logged until it works, right? And so it's a total blind spot from a company perspective.
Totally. And this Bermuda triangle of BYOD, MFA, and personal kind of threat surface is, I think, where I hear from you all the time, or I hear from people in the field all the time, the first misconception is either, well, we have MFA, well, we don't allow BYOD, or the individual's life and accounts are separate. And it's right in that trifecta is where everything is happening, because tell me what people say about MFA.
Yeah, I mean, a good example here, I was talking to a CISO about one of the big incidents last year, Colonial Pipeline, right? And this individual's response was, well, yeah, I understand the personal credentials were compromised, but if MFA had been mandated more thoroughly, that would have prevented this. I hear that all the time, for example. And sometimes
it's not true,
but it's just not true in the majority of cases, especially when you think that individuals are doing things like storing MFA on personal phones. People store MFA authenticators in personal Dropbox accounts. At the end of the day, what you need to do to log in as me is exactly what they did in this case with this DevOps engineer. And it's just not true, to your point, that even if MFA is enabled, that's just something else you need to get from that individual in their personal life. And it may add one more step to what a hacker has to do, but we see all the time that we're getting MFA authentication requests spoofed. We're having people compromise personal devices that hold the authenticator apps. They're compromising personal phone numbers that receive the SMS requests. At the end of the day, the attack surface has moved.
Well, the funny thing is, sometimes you ask these companies, like, do you allow BYODs? And they're like, nope, we don't allow BYOD at all. And it's like, so you're not doing MFA? No, we're doing MFA. I was like, well, where are you doing the MFA? On personal devices. But I thought you just said you don't allow personal devices. And the craziest part of this whole thing is that cyber insurance has now mandated MFA across the board, right? So it's accelerated this problem. Now the only way is through the personal lives to compromise those MFA authentication apps and SMS and all of that. So
you mentioned cyber insurance, and it's too soon to tell how it will play out here, but there are also cases where, because cyber insurance has a number of other requirements, things like endpoint protection. If employees are doing work on personally owned devices that may not have that endpoint protection, cyber insurance is also coming back and saying, well, you weren't in compliance with your policy, we're not going to cover that incident, which is another huge threat surface, a huge risk. Hopefully it doesn't apply to LastPass. I guess we'll see how that plays out. But in a lot of cases, I'm hearing from clients that if they're not protected on those devices that are getting used from work, their insurance companies are saying they weren't in compliance and not covering claims from incidents that happened by those devices.
Yeah, I mean, all right, so we've talked about how big and prevalent this problem is, and probably the number one problem that security professionals need to be thinking about. What do they actually have to do? Like, how do you manage employee targeted risks at a company?
I think about it in two categories, right? It's threats via the team's personal devices, and you and I have talked a bit about that today, right? Because that's this example here, and that's a matter of securing those devices and everything you need to do that, which looks a lot like securing enterprise devices, but because they're personally owned, there are some other challenges. The other side of it is your personal life more broadly, which is everything from your personal accounts. The Cisco data breach, for example, was someone who had a personal Gmail account compromised that they logged into on a work computer, which was permitted by their work, but then a bad actor had a backdoor in because they had access to that personal Gmail, for example. But even more broadly than personal accounts, it's all the other information about us. So things like the personal information that may be out on the dark web from data breaches, or out on the clear web, legitimately exposed because it's public record who my law school roommate was. So at the end of the day, bad actors are putting this information together, what you get publicly and then what you hack into on personal devices. And then from the company's perspective, the bad actor is logging in just as an individual. So if you're thinking about securing, it comes back to those two categories. It's securing people's personally owned devices, and then it's securing their personal lives more broadly, which means their online accounts, and it means that the data about them. I've alluded a few times to it, but maybe you can expand on it. What are some of the challenges that we talk about when it comes to securing these personally owned devices? Because some of it is the same as on the enterprise side, but there are a few unique challenges there.
So I would say that the challenges go into two buckets. There's technical challenges and requirements, and there are policy requirements. On the technical side, you're dealing with a diverse group of devices that are running different software, different OSs, and you probably don't want to be on these devices in a supervisory capacity. That at the end of the day, they belong to the individuals, and so on, and they're going to run software and want privacy. So the technical requirements are very different than what you would do on a standard workstation. The way that you deploy it, like let's take a really simple example. Like, how do you do patch management for such a diverse group of devices? It's a big consideration, and probably patch management is like the most simple thing you want to do. Make sure all these devices are updated to the latest OS and aren't covered by, it's okay, we can edit this stuff. Patch management is one of the simple ones. The other thing is, mobile devices are very different from protecting standard desktop operating systems. So it takes a whole different set of technology and like monitoring and response, and then troubleshooting, and then the IT kind of like service overload for it. So not every team has that internal experience. From a policy perspective, you've got the legal issues around privacy. If you're in Europe, maybe that's GDPR. There's considerations that deal with like legally, how do you handle software on personal devices? What is the privacy that people are entitled to and you want to make sure is happening? The second is around how do you actually get people to want this? Like, how do you get adherence? How do you convince somebody that they need to do this? And like, partially that can be done through policy. Like, hey, this is our company policy. If you want to work from home, if you want to use personal device, if you want to check email on your laptop at home, this is what you have to do. So that's, policy covers some of it, but at the same time, like, you want people to be able to work with that flexibility, and you want them to want to follow these, things. I'd say like one thing that generally doesn't work here is like training. And I'm not saying companies shouldn't do security training, but like security training is one thing. It's a different thing to get people to actually take their security seriously at home with their own data, which is what would solve this problem. If people had that same level of security protection in their personal lives, you don't have these risks coming to the enterprise. So I think it's a combination of both. It's very delicate. I think there's some things that can be done internally. If a company has excessive bandwidth for their team to actually do some of this stuff, you can do it piecemeal. You can do it as like a third-party managed solution. There's a lot of options.
And we see similar challenges out on the exposed data side. A lot of companies may be, for example, monitoring the dark web for exposed corporate data, but are they monitoring the dark web for my personal Facebook credentials, which can be used by a bad actor? Are they monitoring the dark web for other personal credentials of their employees, for example? All of which ultimately is what gets used in these use cases.
I was going to say one thing, like, there's three parts to like the stages of this, right? There's like before anything's happened, while it's happened, and then after it's happened. So like you want to do things that lower the threat profile of these people, like engineers that have access to the keys to encryption, or executives or accounting people or forward-facing employees in your company. Like, you want to reduce their threat surface, dark web monitoring, data removal, personal information removal. Then you actually have to actively like detect intrusion on these devices and prevent against it and monitor it. And then third is risk management. So like, now that something has happened, we're in the middle of it, like, how are you going to mitigate those damages? How quickly you're going to get that keylogger removed from that device? Yep. Once it's been installed.
And how can you do the forensics, right? If the average employee computer, even if you find it later, if you weren't collecting logs on it, you can't even know how long the keylogger was on the device. So that's another piece as well. A big part of your threat intelligence posture is going to be missing if you're not capturing data from attempts both successful and failed on these personally owned devices.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad LastPass shared some more information about this. I think these attacks are more and more common, and it's only sometimes that we get this much insight into how an attack actually occurred. I think these attacks are more common even than they look. So kudos to them, I think, for sharing this. To your point at the beginning of this conversation, it's something that happens to all companies. The important part is to both do the right steps up front and then honestly do the right steps after it happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that hopefully the big takeaway here is that the security community will start thinking about how to address these employee targeted risks, whether it's through policy, software, benefits, but this is only going to become more common.
Yeah, completely agree. All right, well, good conversation. Glad we talked about this today. Thanks, Amir.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler.
Bye.